Hey everyone, today's story is about a boy who dreamed of becoming the strongest in another world. But every time he got reincarnated, he only received another useless skill. After 4 failed lives and countless disappointments, his 5th reincarnation finally changes everything. So with that said, let's begin the story. Several mourners knelt before the wooden coffin and wept quietly, their shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A young woman, her voice trembling, said that the deceased was only 17 years old and hadn't even had time to finish reading the very book he had been holding in his hands before he died. Sighing with deep sadness, an elderly man felt it important to note that this unfortunate child had been in extremely poor health from birth, and doctors had long warned his parents of the possible consequences. And yet, with respect in his voice, he explained that the young man had truly held his own until the very end and had never once complained about his fate. At that moment, the grieving family members decided to place that very unfinished book in the coffin next to the deceased, as if sending him off on his final journey with his favorite possession. After the somber farewell ceremony ended, a young woman with light hair, wiping away the tears streaming down her cheeks, said that if there is another world, as wonderful as the ones in the books he loved to read, she sincerely hoped that the deceased young man's next life would be just as beautiful and exciting as the stories described in his favorite novels. At that very moment, the protagonist suddenly found himself in a strange and frightening space, where everything around him was dazzlingly white and majestic Greek columns stood, soaring high into the endless sky. He noticed an antique hourglass right in front of him, with sand shimmering inside. The protagonist heard an unfamiliar voice informing him that this place was called the Room of Reincarnation, where the souls of the dead go. A mysterious stranger in a long, snow-white robe calmly explained that a soul who had died an unnatural and violent death and had long wandered in endless darkness ends up right here for rebirth. The protagonist was taken aback by this unexpected turn of events and couldn't believe that reincarnation, which he had read so much about in books, actually existed. And yet the angel girl was genuinely surprised by the young man's calm reaction to such shocking news and asked if perhaps he had been aware of this outcome, even while he was still alive. He raised his head and took a deep breath. The young man wiped the remaining tears from his pale face and stated firmly that he had always secretly dreamed of being reincarnated in another world, but had never thought it would turn out to be the absolute truth. And he certainly never expected that this incredible event would happen to him, of all people, an ordinary guy in poor health. At that very moment, the protagonist began to reflect deeply on his untimely death, imagining that, in a sense, he was lucky to have died accidentally and quickly, rather than as a result of a long and agonizing illness or a traffic accident that might have maimed his body. Moreover, with cold, clear-headed reasoning, he understood that there are quite a few ways to die, and he had been dealt one of the easiest. Frowning at his strange behavior, the girl couldn't for the life of her understand exactly why this remarkable young man was acting so calmly and even joyfully. And yet, the protagonist boldly addressed the mysterious goddess and, with hope in his eyes, asked if she would grant him some special ability so that he could become the strongest and most invincible fighter in this new world. Genuinely surprised by such incredible persistence, the girl calmly explained that reincarnated souls are granted exactly one divine blessing upon rebirth, and they cannot choose it. Exhaling in utter astonishment, the protagonist felt an incredible sense of relief at the words of his mysterious interlocutor. With a gentle smile, the goddess politely asked the protagonist to take a seat in a comfortable chair nearby so they could continue their conversation in a more comfortable setting. Making no attempt to hide his genuine joy, the young man readily agreed that he would be more than happy to comply with this simple request. Gazing at the boundless universe stretching beyond the transparent walls, the goddess slowly stood up behind the young man, and in a solemn voice, she announced that the blessing he would receive in this reincarnation was the ability to remove. This unique ability allows him to remove any magical locks from sealed chests and lift ancient curses from enchanted weapons. Upon receiving this modest artifact, the protagonist remarked with disappointment that it was, of course, convenient in everyday life. But it was not at all what he had so passionately expected from a divine gift. Deeply upset, he turned to the goddess with a desperate question. How was he now supposed to become the strongest warrior with such a weak and, at first glance, useless skill? And yet, the removal skill turned out to be incredibly valuable among experienced adventurers and desperate treasure hunters, and it was precisely for this reason that the young man ultimately had no serious trouble surviving in the harsh world of adventure. The protagonist arrived in the bustling capital to explore ancient ruins just a few days ago, and quite by accident, he found an inactive stone golem in an abandoned dungeon. It had already been a full 20 years since the young man had been reborn in this dangerous otherworld, filled with magic and monsters. However, This was the first time in all those long years that he had seen such a gigantic golem of an unprecedented design. The dark-haired man, his companion, explained with admiration that, by all appearances, this mighty golem was bound by a powerful ancient seal that no one could break. Turning to Faith, he said with hope in his voice that this was precisely why everyone present was eagerly awaiting the talented young man to lift this dangerous curse with his unique ability. He flashed his trademark smile. The protagonist noted with great surprise that golems become loyal servants to those brave souls who successfully activate them and awaken them from their slumber. Moreover, with a touch of embarrassment, he asked his friend if he would mind if he became the rightful master of this majestic golem. Responding with a firm no, the dark-haired man explained with a kind smile that, as a true scientist, he simply wanted to observe the golem in action and study its mechanisms. He had no need for power. He nodded in complete agreement. The protagonist solemnly raised his hand, holding the shimmering key high above his head, and announced in a firm voice that it was time to begin the activation. Activating his magical skill to remove the ancient seal, the protagonist continued to stand in the center of the spacious hall, trying not to move and focusing entirely on the process. He pondered deeply on the fact that standing right before him was a unique golem, one never before seen even by the most experienced and wise scholars who had devoted their entire lives to studying these creatures. Faith still couldn't believe that very soon he would become the rightful master of this majestic golem. And finally, his long-awaited story as the mightiest warrior in another world would begin. At that very moment, the magical seal was completely broken, and the beautiful goddess, who had been imprisoned inside the golem, looked gratefully at her liberator. Gazing at the mysterious girl with great admiration, Faith greeted her respectfully. But suddenly he felt a sharp, unbearable pain right in his chest, as if someone had pierced his heart with a dagger. The scientist standing behind him began to laugh loudly and maliciously. He remarked that this naive young man was far too foolish and trusting for such a dangerous world. At that moment, with an icy smirk, he declared that if the one who activated the golem were to die before he could issue his first command, the right to give orders would automatically pass to the other person standing nearby. Gritting his teeth against the excruciating pain tearing through his body, the protagonist declared with hatred that this vile man was a true traitor who had been waiting for just the right moment. At that very moment, the beautiful goddess proudly introduced herself as Danshua River and began her full activation, preparing to serve her new master. Smiling his most satisfied smile, the scientist placed his hand on his chest in a theatrical gesture, announcing to the entire hall that he was now the true master of this powerful creature. However, the dying Faith managed to beat him to it. With his last ounce of strength, he called out his name and addressed the lady, telling her that it was he who had freed her from her centuries-long imprisonment. Enraged to the point of fury, the dark-haired man shouted that this worthless adventurer should have perished long ago from his poison, and menacingly swung his arm for a final blow. Instantly, she thwarted the treacherous attack. Danshua announced in her icy voice that the enemy had been successfully eliminated and that she was now awaiting further instructions from her master, Faith. When the long-awaited response failed to come, the alarmed girl cautiously approached Faith, tried to wake him and bring him to his senses. However, the protagonist had long since awakened in the familiar room of reincarnation, where everything was exactly as it had been 20 years ago during his first rebirth. The same dazzlingly white walls, the same majestic Greek columns, and the same otherworldly, flickering light pouring in from nowhere. Greeting him with her usual courtesy, the goddess once again began to explain the purpose of this mysterious place and what the soul would experience during the process of reincarnation. However, she suddenly stopped speaking the moment she clearly saw Faith's face before her. Stunned by the surprise, she asked in bewilderment why on earth he had ended up in this place again, and so incredibly soon after his last rebirth. Angered by the injustice of fate, Faith explained this time that it was all because he had once again died an unnatural and violent death at the hands of a traitor. Tilting her head to one side in genuine surprise, she asked curiously, could it be that this perpetually dissatisfied guy is still not satisfied with his life? The protagonist immediately and resolutely answered in the negative, and with eyes ablaze, he declared that he wanted to acquire a skill that would allow him to eliminate enormous dragons with a single blow. Or perhaps the young man would prefer a universal skill that would raise his level to astronomical and unattainable heights, the kind others could only dream of. And yet the goddess had absolutely no idea what this strange young man was saying, since she didn't know the meaning of some of the modern words he used in his speech. However, instead of offering patient explanations, the protagonist impulsively declared that, in any case, he wouldn't be satisfied with anything until he became OP. Wanting to at least somewhat justify her incompetence, the goddess sheepishly explained that her divine blessings were granted at random, and she had no control over the process. Sitting down in a chair with the look of a sulking child, Faith impatiently asked her to reincarnate him again as soon as possible. After all, in his firm opinion, this was exactly the place he needed for that. And yet, the wise lady gently asked the young man to be a little more grateful for the second chance at life he'd been given, since not everyone is granted such a unique opportunity. Folding his hands in sincere prayer, the protagonist begged God with all his might to grant him that very special skill that would finally make him a truly invincible warrior. After a few agonizing seconds of tense anticipation, the lady solemnly announced that this time, the blessing Faith would receive was called attracting attention. At that very moment, the protagonist had the distinct feeling that this was yet another complete and utter failure of his hopes. It turned out that attracting attention was an extremely specific skill that forcibly drew the attention of any opponent. The protagonist bitterly realized that, as expected, this wasn't exactly a cheat or OP, but rather a completely useless skill. However, today, for the first time, this strange skill unexpectedly proved useful in a real-life situation. As he fled from the enraged dragon across the battlefield, the young man shouted at the top of his lungs that it was good he'd at least managed to lure this dangerous monster away from the defenseless village. But that wasn't what he'd asked the gods for at all. Looking up with a mixture of hope and despair, the protagonist saw Chuko's familiar silhouette and, with all his might, called out to her for help. Chuko asked with curiosity what exactly her friend was up to and guessed that he was playing a game of tag. Trying to brush it off as a joke, the protagonist declared that his friend was absolutely right, and that if he were caught, he would die. As she approached the dragon, the young woman noted that the game of tag was over. She sliced through the ground with her sword in one confident stroke. She declared that Faith was her gaming partner. Smiling, the protagonist turned to his friend with sincere gratitude for saving him. It turned out that Chuko was Faith's childhood friend, and they were literally born on the same day. Until the age of 5, the protagonist often protected the girl from bullies and stray dogs. But now the young man realized that the time had come when he himself could be the one in need of protection. Looking at the defeated dragon, the protagonist realized he felt a sharp pang of envy toward his friend's strength. And yet he kept smiling and said it was time to return to the village. At that very moment, the young people noticed the dragon, which was still within their line of sight and showing signs of life. When the monster began breathing fire, the protagonist leaped forward, declaring that things were looking bad. At that very moment, he pushed his friend aside to shield her from fatal damage. Looking at the enemy, Faith remembered his skill for drawing attention. At that moment, he regretted not having a cheat skill that would give him a clear advantage in battle. Besides, he realized he could have looked much cooler if he possessed a unique ability. However, the defense was unsuccessful, and the protagonist underwent the reincarnation process once again. This time, he gained the skill of clairvoyance, which allowed him to see far distances and glimpse the future just a little. Using this skill, Faith led his companion to the Demon Lord. Looking at his exhausted partner, he regretted that he hadn't been able to defeat the enemy on his own, as originally planned. Looking at his dark-haired friend, Faith noted that they had, after all, managed to defeat the enemy. And yet, the brave dark-haired man pointed out that there were still monsters left. And from now on, he would be counting on Faith's guiding skills. Clenching his hand into a fist, the protagonist raised it, wanting to say that next time he would try even harder. However, he was interrupted by the Demon Lord, who had awakened after taking damage. The monster was beside himself with rage and, for that reason, screamed that he would take the young man with him. Not wanting to put his friend in danger, the protagonist rushed toward the monster, shouting loudly to draw its attention to himself. But at that very moment, the dark-haired boy stopped and stared ahead, unable to believe his eyes. Falling to his knees, the protagonist prayed, hoping that this time he would definitely prove himself a true hero. The next minute, the dark-haired adventurer watched his friend die, powerless to change anything. During his 4th reincarnation, the protagonist gained the ability to heal his own wounds at superhuman speed. Thanks to his ability to regenerate, the young man was able to fight without serious problems and finally felt more confident. Thanks to his regenerative abilities, the protagonist managed to live a long and fulfilling life. His grandchildren, gathered around him, wept, exclaiming that they did not want their close relative to die. A man also leaned over the bed and thanked Faith for raising him, even though he himself had been a foundling. Recalling his childhood, the man thanked his father for showing him what true family happiness was. Hugging his tearful grandchildren, the main character turned to them and said that, in fact, they were the ones who had taught him compassion and love. He also noted that he had been incredibly happy to spend his life with his loved ones. Sobbing, the little girl promised that she would study magic diligently in order to bring her grandfather back to life. Smiling, Faith said there was no need to bring back to life someone as old and wise as he was. He explained his decision by saying he had already lived more than long enough in this world. As he prepared for his final moments, the protagonist looked at his grandchildren and realized that if he had any regrets at all, it was that he had never managed to become OP. A few moments later, the girl screamed loudly, trying to call out to her grandfather, who could no longer answer. At that very moment, Faith found himself back in the reincarnation chamber. The goddess who served in this temple was extremely displeased that the young man had ended up here again. She shook him by the shoulders, unable to understand why he had once again met an unnatural death. At that moment, the girl asked what exactly went wrong this time. Wasn't dying surrounded by a loving family the best possible ending? Lowering his head, Faith admitted that in the very end, he regretted only one thing. He had never become OP. After hearing this, the goddess soon set the protagonist down on a chair and informed him that if he couldn't calm down, other reincarnated souls wouldn't be able to enter this place. However, Faith declared that this was too harsh a treatment of him, and he demanded more courtesy and respect. When the procedure was complete, the goddess rose from her seat and asked the young man to leave the hall as well. After his fifth reincarnation, the protagonist was unaware of his new ability, as the girl had been in such a hurry that she had forgotten to tell him about it. Since Faith was unaware of his new ability, he had to rely on the skills he'd acquired in his past lives. He possessed regeneration, dispel, clairvoyance, and provocation. The protagonist needed all these abilities to work as an ordinary jack of all trades and in a rank group in his new life. Trying to keep up with all his tasks, the protagonist shouldered a huge travel backpack. The hero's group, consisting of 4 people, looked at him and criticized his work. One of them said there was nothing they could do and that all they could do was rest. The dark-haired leader asked Faith to gather all their belongings. And yet the protagonist understood that with his 4 skills, it was impossible to defeat a powerful monster. However, for a jack of all trades, this was a very valuable set of abilities. Looking at the belongings of the other team members, the protagonist realized that his life was meant to have turned out completely differently. At that very moment, one of the girls said she wasn't very tired and planned to help Faith. Trying to call out to her friend, she walked toward him. Suddenly, the adventurers tensed up and, turning around, saw a large monster that looked like a monstrous beast. Distinct clicking sounds began to echo around them, and the group's leader declared that the very same dark wanderer stood before them. Stunned, Faith couldn't believe that an S-rank monster was standing before them. Even the team captain realized that such a monster was beyond their capabilities. As soon as the creature, which looked like a giant centipede, sped up and began moving toward the adventurers, the dark-haired man loudly ordered everyone to retreat. And yet the protagonist remained where he was, and he ordered his friends to run for their lives. He threw off his heavy backpack. He declared that he was tired of being just a pack mule, not wanting to leave her friend behind. The girl stopped, trying to change his mind. However, Faith was adamant and, contrary to everyone's expectations, headed straight toward the monster. Looking at the creature, Faith realized that he had always wanted to be the one who could defeat such an enemy with a single blow. At the same time, though, he realized that the only thing he was truly capable of was holding the enemy back and drawing its attention to himself. Looking into the monster's eyes, the protagonist reflected that he no longer saw any point in endless reincarnation. In the final moments before his death, he recalled all the loved ones who had been by his side in his various lives. Faith remembered that he had once considered his greatest strength to be his ability to never give up. Looking at himself on the outside, he wondered, can I even pretend to be a cool, fearless guy? And yet Faith realized that he had promised himself he'd try harder next time, but nothing had worked out. Besides, he remembered that he shouldn't leave any regrets behind. At that moment, the protagonist's mood shifted dramatically, and he made a firm decision to defeat the monster at any cost. In a panic, he prayed for his 5th skill, which had remained a mystery until now, to activate. At the same time, the goddess looked around, realizing she had forgotten to tell Faith something about his true power. However, on the battlefield, Faith saw a glowing magic circle before him, and then a grand summoning of heroes began. To his surprise, Faith discovered that, thanks to his new skill, he could summon all the warriors and friends from his past into his new world. Danshua River activated her spell to eliminate the enemy, and she dealt devastating damage to the monster. Smiling, Chuko announced that, to start with, they needed to get rid of one small obstacle. Then the girl used a magical glove to deal with the dragon. Watching the events unfold, Bryn, the king of heroes, prepared for battle, knowing he simply had to do it. He moved forward. He planned to show everyone present the results of his rigorous training. The high elf Lulu Bell, whose power knew no bounds, also appeared on the battlefield. The protagonist, not understanding what was happening, was completely taken aback. Joining forces, the heroes managed to quickly defeat the enemy, and each of them approached Faith with a warm greeting. Dancho remarked that she hadn't seen her master in a long time, and Tsuko was delighted that Faith wanted to play with her again. On top of that, Bren announced that he had come to see the young man's achievements with his own eyes. Smiling, a young girl named Lulu Bell greeted Faith, noting that she was his granddaughter and that she had finally outgrown her own grandfather. Delighted to see his old acquaintances, Faith ran to meet them. He knew that this time, together with the four of them, he would be able to prove to the whole world that he was OP. Looking forward to new, thrilling adventures and epic battles, the protagonist realized that this rebirth would be his last and his best. Greeting his loyal companions, the protagonist sincerely thanked them for managing to come together in this difficult world. He also explained that he was once again counting on their invaluable help and support, just as he had many times before. The girl who had been watching Faith from a distance approached him, at first timidly and uncertainly. Then she hugged the young man tightly, shouting joyfully that she was overjoyed to see her beloved grandfather right in front of her again. Smiling, Lulu Bell remarked that her grandfather looked much younger and had even changed a little over the past few years. Faith then explained that, in reality, his granddaughter had grown up much faster than he could ever have imagined. As she hugged her relative, the girl was genuinely happy to once again be able to do so without any restrictions. And yet, the main character felt a bit awkward, since in this new world he wasn't even 20 years old yet, and people were already calling him Grandpa. This conversation instantly piqued Tsuko's interest, and she asked Faith a direct question. Since they were calling him Grandpa, did that mean he had married someone in the other world and started a family? However, Faith quickly explained that he hadn't gotten married, and that he and Lulu Bell weren't related by blood, but only by a deep emotional bond. After hearing his answer, the girl paused for a moment, taking it all in. Then she held out her arms for a hug and declared that if the guy had married someone else, she would have smacked him on the head as a congratulatory gesture. Taken aback by this statement, the protagonist argued that such a way of congratulating someone was fundamentally wrong and contrary to all moral standards. Suddenly, Faith heard someone very familiar and painfully dear to him greet him. Turning around, he saw the King of Heroes, who was genuinely delighted that the young man had survived all the turmoil safe and sound. Smiling, Faith turned to Bren and asked how he was doing and what he'd been up to. Then Bren, with a touch of embarrassment, admitted that he had immediately spent the entire reward for defeating the Demon Lord on entertainment. Hearing this, Faith was taken aback and asked him to repeat himself, thinking he must have misheard. Besides, he knew that with the substantial sum of money he'd been awarded for the victory, he could have bought himself a castle. However, Bren admitted that he'd been drinking heavily and couldn't remember at all exactly where he'd spent all the money he'd won. Moreover, when he came to his senses after a long binge, he realized he was deeply in debt. Thumbing up with a satisfied smile, Bren admitted that Faith had really saved him by summoning him to another world just as his creditors were already at the door. However, the very next moment, the golem Danchua approached the protagonist, and she expressed her deepest gratitude. Noticing the young man's slight confusion, she explained that she hadn't previously had the opportunity to thank him for removing the seal that had kept her imprisoned for many years. After listening to her, the protagonist asked about her fate after he had been reincarnated into another world. Danchua admitted that everything had been fine since then, and she had been waiting quietly in the ruins for a moment to come. Standing up straight, she pointed to herself and solemnly declared that from now on, she would be Faith's loyal right-hand woman, carrying out his every command. After listening to her, the protagonist smiled warmly and told her that she, too, could count on his help in any situation. Stunned by these words, Danchua could not believe that a man was making reciprocal vows to her instead of demanding unquestioning obedience. And yet she declared that she was Mr. Faith's property, and that he could treat her as a mere tool or weapon. At that moment, Faith gently pointed out that, personally, he would like to consider her a companion, not a soulless object. Bowing her head in respect, Danchua acknowledged that she understood what the young man was saying, and now she would accompany him as a loyal partner, not as a slave. Still, Bren wanted to know the plan of action moving forward, since standing around and chatting wasn't his style. The protagonist explained that, to start with, they needed to urgently inform the guild that the Dark Wanderer monster had been permanently eliminated. After all, it was now completely safe to move through the dungeon without fearing for one's life. Faith was certain that all the adventurers would be delighted by this news. As they neared the guild building, Bren explained that they would wait for the young man a short distance away so as not to attract unnecessary attention. At that moment, the protagonist asked sincerely, "Why aren't you coming in with him?" Tsuko explained that they weren't from this world, and they shouldn't draw unnecessary attention to themselves. After a moment's thought, The protagonist agreed and explained that it really was best to do just that to avoid unnecessary questions. However, Lulu Bell really wanted to go with Faith, but she obediently stayed with the group anyway. Waving goodbye, the young man told his companions that it was time for him to go and disappeared through the guild's doors. Once inside, the protagonist addressed the adventurers as his comrades in arms and warmly greeted them. Everyone present could hardly believe that Faith had managed to survive that terrifying encounter with the Wanderer of Darkness. The adventurers couldn't hold back their tears, and one of them was having a particularly hard time. He turned to the protagonist with great difficulty, barely moving his lips. Then he revealed that, according to Azette, Faith's team had been attacked by that very same Wanderer of Darkness, and none of them could quite believe that Faith had managed to return alive. Smiling, the protagonist announced that everything was fine. Moreover, the Dark Wanderer had been defeated once and for all and no longer posed a threat. Judging by the adventurers' reaction, the young man realized they had no idea about this good news. The adventurers cautiously asked again, who managed to defeat such a monster, and how? The crowd began to argue noisily, trying to figure out exactly who this mysterious hero was who had defeated a high-rank creature. Someone suggested that an S-rank adventurer had simply been passing by and accidentally vanquished the monster. Many were convinced that Faith could hardly have defeated it alone, since that was beyond a realm of possibility for a novice. However, at that moment, the protagonist realized that he had been striving all this time precisely for this moment of truth. He then looked proudly at the crowd and admitted that he had eliminated the Dark Wanderer with his own hands. Everyone present was shocked by such a candid confession. Many asked each other for confirmation, while some said outright that this simply couldn't be true. It defied all known laws. Furthermore, the protagonist was told that if he were lying, it would be exposed immediately, and he would be deeply ashamed in front of everyone. Without a moment's hesitation, the protagonist declared that if someone else had eliminated the Dark Wanderer, that person would have long since come to the guild to report what had happened. Several adventurers noted that this was a perfectly fair and logical argument that couldn't be disputed. And yet, Faith asked the question again. Was he really capable of defeating such high-level monsters all by himself? After answering confidently and in the affirmative, the protagonist felt the crowd joyfully toss him into the air, cheering and celebrating with all their hearts. He heard loud praise coming from all sides, promises of multiple rank promotions, and constant requests for advice on clearing dungeons. As he savored this moment of true glory, Faith realized he was experiencing genuine happiness, and he felt like a true OP, capable of anything. Feeling true joy, he silently thanked the goddess for this opportunity and his long-time, loyal companions who had always been by his side. At the same time, Lulu Bell was secretly watching everything that was happening in the guild. She smiled warmly, noticing that her beloved grandfather seemed to be spinning tall tales again, just like in the good old days. Upon hearing this, Chuko remarked that it made everything many times more interesting and exciting. Still, Danshua explained that they had all been summoned to this world by the power of faith, and for that reason, she felt it was quite important to point out that it was he, and not some outsider, who had defeated the monster. However, Bryn laughed out loud, saying that after such a statement, the girl would still have to pay for everyone's dinner. At that moment, it became clear that the girls had been watching the events unfold from quite a height, standing on the broad shoulders of Danshua and Bryn himself. At that moment, Bryn complained that his legs were aching badly from the strain and that it was time to stop spying on Faith. However, Chuko disagreed, declaring that the most interesting part was just beginning, and that missing the climax would be a real crime. However, one of the female warriors in the guild pointed out that the young man's words sounded extremely dubious and implausible. As an S-rank adventurer, Lavi explained that if everything he said was the absolute truth, she herself would personally recommend a rank promotion to the guild council. And yet, the girl found it incredibly hard to believe this unbelievable story. The protagonist was somewhat afraid that everyone would realize he had deliberately lied for a moment of glory. For this very reason, he suggested that the adventurers follow him right away to verify that the Dark Wanderer had indeed been eliminated and that its body lay at the battle site. Lavi didn't want to go anywhere, and so she said there was a much simpler way to test the guy's words. Stretching her arm forward with a confident gesture, Lavi told Faith that he had to defeat her in a fair and open battle. Watching the young man's reaction, she emphasized that if everything he'd said was true and the Dark Wanderer had indeed been defeated, then this battle would be extremely simple and easy for the protagonist. Lowering his head, Faith didn't know how to proceed in this difficult situation. Moreover, he realized that he simply wouldn't be able to defeat such an experienced adventurer in direct combat, given the difference in their levels and skills. Looking into the eyes of his formidable opponent, Faith began frantically coming up with excuses to call off the match for a valid reason. He also realized that his current situation looked very pitiful and helpless, and that all his words sounded like the empty excuses of a coward. At that moment, he recalled the encouraging words of his loyal comrades, who had always been amazed by his abilities and inner strength. As he pondered his next move, the protagonist finally resolved not to back out of the fight, no matter what the cost. And for that reason, after a few seconds of tense silence, he addressed the warrior with a firm declaration that he accepted the duel. At that moment, Faith smiled broadly as if nothing had happened and declared loudly that he would show the girl the very same incredible strength that had helped him defeat the Wanderer of Darkness. Meanwhile, Faith's friends, who were outside and peeking in through the window to watch everything that was happening, were taken aback by such a bold declaration. They knew there was nothing left to do but wish Faith good luck in such a difficult and dangerous contest. All the adventurers present in the guild scattered to make room for the battle, and Lavi solemnly drew her gleaming sword. Glancing around, Faith realized he didn't stand a single chance of winning this fight fairly. On top of that, he blamed himself for letting the sweet taste of glory cloud his judgment and push him into reckless actions. However, at that moment, it suddenly dawned on him, as if lightning had struck out of a clear blue sky. Thinking on his feet, he reasoned that if he couldn't defeat Lavi outright, he could try to make it look as though it were a clear and indisputable victory. Deciding to use his so-called useless skills, Faith chose divination and clairvoyance. However, his deep thoughts were interrupted by Lavi herself, who announced that time was running out and it was finally time to begin the duel. Gripping his wooden sword, he reminded himself that he had only one chance at success, and he couldn't let it slip away under any circumstances. Preparing to strike, Faith announced loudly that he was about to attack. He moved toward the warrior. He activated his skills and discovered that his opponent was moving incredibly fast like the wind. Even with his ability to see a few moments into the future, he couldn't dodge her lightning-fast attacks in time. That's when Faith realized a brilliant tactic. If he started dodging an attack he had already seen in advance, as soon as it appeared in his vision, he would surely be able to dodge it just as the actual blow landed. Struggling to hold his ground with all his might, Faith thought about what a first-rate and skilled swordswoman stood before him, and how lucky he was to face such a formidable opponent. Ducking out of the way at the last moment, the protagonist realized he was ready for the next move and could continue the fight. Even though he lacked any offensive abilities capable of dealing even the slightest damage to his opponent, he was a master of disarming techniques. It was precisely thanks to this unique ability that Faith managed to discreetly turn the key in the girl's armor, unlocking the clasps one by one. All the adventurers were shocked by what they saw and asked each other what had happened, unable to believe their eyes. Smiling from ear to ear, Faith realized he'd succeeded, and his crazy plan had worked perfectly. At that moment, the warrior's heavy armor crashed to the ground with a thunderous roar, leaving Lavi virtually defenseless. Cheering with delight, the young people shouted loudly, bombarding Faith with questions about what had happened. Many were baffled as to how the young man had managed to remove the girl's armor so quickly and carefully using nothing but a wooden sword. The protagonist was genuinely delighted that he had succeeded despite all his doubts and fears. His ingenious plan was to quietly unfasten the armor's clasps and then make a dramatic swing of his sword, so that no one would doubt he had done it with the weapon. With his disarming smile, he turned to his opponent and declared that victory was his. However, the girl was extremely displeased with this unexpected turn of events, and in response, she struck the young man on the head with her sword. A few minutes later, when tempers had cooled somewhat, Lavi loudly declared that her opponent was an extremely foolish and arrogant person, since she had sustained no physical damage from him. Agreeing with what he'd heard, Faith realized that avoiding damage had also been his main goal, since he didn't want to maim his opponent. Moreover, he realized that he had managed to create the perfect illusion of victory, and Lavi had clearly seen through his cunning plan. However, to his great surprise, the warrior declared that this match was quite sufficient to pass. Stunned by the unexpected turn of events, Faith looked at the warrior again, trying to figure out if she was joking or being serious. As she said goodbye, the adventuress clarified that this was, after all, a personal defeat for her. Still, she noted that Faith had dodged her lightning-fast attacks with great ease and grace, and that his armor had been stripped away instantly, as if by magic. The adventurers continued to cheer wildly, noting that Faith would now be a high-ranking fighter in the guild, and his name would resound throughout the entire region. And yet the protagonist asked his opponent why she was counting this fight as a win for him, since technically he hadn't won. As she got dressed, the girl remarked that she had been certain from the very beginning that the young man had indeed defeated the Wanderer of Darkness. Otherwise, he wouldn't have acted so confidently. Besides, she didn't care at all whether the young man had been strong from the start or had only recently acquired incredible power. Gazing admiringly at his wise companion, Faith fell silent, unable to find the right words. A short while later, the young man was standing at the guild's reception desk, filling out the necessary paperwork. The clerk, her voice warm, told him that Faith had truly amazed her with his bold actions and brilliant victory. Smiling, the protagonist declared that his years of effort and countless reincarnations had finally begun to pay off. The girl then said she would like such a talented adventurer to have a higher status, one worthy of his talents. However, it turned out that to officially confirm his new status, he would need to complete at least 3 difficult A-rank quests. Still, the staff member asked whether Faith had indeed already completed 2 A-rank quests as part of the Azet group. Agreeing, the protagonist thought to himself that he had actually been nothing more than a foot soldier and had nearly died several times while carrying out others' orders. Smiling, the girl explained that there was only one task left, and that quest was to eliminate the mysterious monster that had attacked the Great Komoria Empire. Showing him a magazine clipping with a picture of the monster, she asked the young man to accept this crucial quest. After carefully studying the information, Faith surmised that the quest would be extremely dangerous and unpredictable, since it didn't seem like the country was facing a typical monster invasion. The staff member then stated that this was an official request from the Imperial Order of Knights, and for that very reason, the quest had the highest priority among all current assignments. In addition, she warned that the 2 previous groups of adventurers who had taken on this mission apparently, they had been completely wiped out by the monster. Aware of her companion's emotional state, the girl clarified that this was precisely why they were seriously considering revising the rank of this deadly mission. Stunned by this news, the protagonist asked if this was truly an S-rank quest. He received an affirmative answer. He was genuinely frightened by the enormous responsibility that had suddenly fallen on his frail shoulders. With an encouraging smile, the staff member assured him that Mr. Faith could be entrusted with this difficult task with complete confidence, given his recent achievements. Holding back a storm of emotions, pride and fear for the future at the same time, he thought of his loyal friends who had always been by his side and firmly declared that the guild could rely on him completely. Leaving the guild building, the protagonist looked around carefully, until he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Turning around, he was genuinely surprised to find that his loyal friends had been so close all along, literally just a few steps from the entrance. Smiling, Lulu Bell explained with relief that they were very lucky, since the adventurous Faith had turned out to be a kind, wise, and understanding woman. Recalling Lavi's piercing gaze, the protagonist fully agreed with his beloved granddaughter's opinion. Still, Chuko also asked whether they were heading straight to the Empire to meet the client or if they had other plans. Shaking his head, Faith explained that they first needed to submit all the reports on the work they completed, then take on a couple more assignments from a guild, and all of that would take at least a little more time. He also handed his friends a heavy sack filled to the brim with gold coins. He explained that it contained their well-deserved reward for defeating the dreadful Wanderer of Darkness. Bryn was pleasantly surprised by this news, and later, he was even happier when he learned that Faith had bought a detailed city guide and that they had the chance to take a lovely stroll and relax. Approaching Faith with a clear intention, Bryn decided to take the bag of gold for himself to keep it safe. But he was suddenly stopped by the main character, who loudly declared that he would never entrust Bryn with such a large sum of money. Laughing in response, Bryn declared that the sum could be tripled if his friends would simply trust his brilliant and crazy plan to multiply their capital. However, Faith disagreed with his friend's opinion, and, after a brief debate, it was unanimously decided that all the money would be entrusted to Danchua River as the most reliable and responsible member of the team. Chuko and Lulu Bell were genuinely outraged, believing that they, too, had every right to manage the team's finances. However, the protagonist was adamant in his decision, explaining that the girls might spend the entire sum at once on unnecessary things in an extremely reckless and impulsive manner. After that, he warmly said goodbye to his friends and went on his way. Standing by the open window and watching his friends walk away, Faith suddenly recalled an important lesson from his distant past life. He remembered that a team made up exclusively of the best and strongest players rarely achieves true success. Watching his boisterous friends, Faith sincerely hoped that they wouldn't start arguing among themselves and accidentally destroy the entire city while having fun. Looking around with genuine interest, Chuko addressed the golem as Chuari and asked sweetly where exactly they were headed next. Noticing her companion's surprised reaction, the girl explained that Danchua River was a rather long and complicated name, one that would be quite tedious to pronounce every single time. Besides, Chuko explained that since they'd entrusted the money to Chuari, that meant she was now in charge, and they would follow her lead. Chuari then admitted that she had spent a long time all alone in empty, abandoned ruins, and so she didn't know any places where she could have fun and enjoy herself. Putting her arm around her friend's shoulders, Chuko gently explained that they would be more than happy to show her some wonderful places in the city. Bren supported this initiative, saying it was a great idea and that he'd be happy to join them as well. Surprised by such a warm welcome, Chuari sincerely thanked her new friends for their understanding and kindness. Lulubelle also asked her friends to think carefully about where exactly they could take Chuari on their first outing to make the best impression. Inspired by this task, Chuko explained that first they would definitely go to a store to buy some beautiful new clothes. At that moment, she noted that Chuari was a very beautiful girl in her own right, but her current outfits looked extremely old-fashioned and didn't flatter her figure. As soon as the girls entered the store, Chuko cheerfully announced that she would pick out many different outfits and that Chuari would have to try on every single one of them, without exception. Upon entering the spacious fitting room, Chuko mentioned that she'd brought plenty of clothes to suit every taste. Flustered by all this attention, Chuari kept thanking her friend for such a thoughtful and caring gesture. A few minutes later, Chuko was all set to show off Chuari's fresh, radiant new look to the rest of their friends. Bren and Lulubelle couldn't believe just how beautiful and unique Chuari turned out to be when they saw her in her new outfit. However, at that very moment, Chuko meaningfully warned them that she had something even better in store and hadn't shown them the most interesting options yet. Chuko proudly showed her friends one new look after another, each one she had carefully selected for Chuari with great love and taste. Bren and Lulubelle marveled at how some outfits were cute and charming, while others looked cool and edgy, highlighting Chuari's personality. Looking at herself in the large mirror, Chuari asked her friend, a little shyly, whether Mr. Faith would like these outfits when he saw them. Chuko then confidently remarked that Faith would definitely be absolutely thrilled by such a transformation. However, at that very moment, she suddenly pulled the outfit her friend had just put on right off her. She explained that, in that case, it would be better to dress less attractively so as not to distract the young man from his important business. Moreover, she rushed out of the dressing room, loudly declaring that she wouldn't let Danshua try on any of the remaining beautiful outfits if Danshua started getting too close and friendly with Faith. Still, Chuari felt it was important to explain that she hadn't meant to act that way at all. She simply wanted to look neat and beautiful. Laughing heartily, Bren turned to Chuko with a playful suggestion that he pick out something cute and charming for her himself, so she wouldn't worry or get jealous for no reason. Pausing for a moment, Chuko instinctively agreed with her friend and went to pick out an outfit for herself so she could take part in the try-ons as well. When the young people left the store with their purchases, the angry owner approached the bewildered sales clerk. She began shouting loudly about the torn corset that had been left behind in the fitting room. The young salesman tried to calm her down, explaining that the customers had paid in full for all the items, and for that reason, there was no need to get so worked up over one small defect. The shop owner then explained indignantly that the torn item was an exclusive piece made from the famous, durable wyvern leather, which cannot be torn by ordinary means. Moreover, the woman had heard that no adventurer or monster could even slightly damage this unique material. And it was precisely for this reason that the shop owner had personally ordered this corset for her most expensive display case. Even more enraged, she announced that she would immediately contact the supplier with a strong complaint about the substandard product, which did not meet the advertised specifications. Standing in the central square, Chuko clutched a pile of bags filled with new clothes and wondered with curiosity where exactly they were headed next. Then Lulubelle mysteriously remarked that this time she herself would take the young people to the right and very special place. She also explained that she had long dreamed of visiting that place herself, but hadn't had the right company. A short while later, Lulubelle solemnly introduced her friends to a beautiful bookstore filled with both old and new editions. As she wandered through the spacious hall, she marveled at the pleasant scent of paper, ink, and knowledge that lingered in the air. Moreover, Lulubelle explained that by reading books from this world, one could gain a deeper understanding of its culture, history, and customs. She was certain that this was by no means a useless pursuit, but rather a very important and enlightening one. Looking at the tall bookshelves filled with a wide variety of literature, Chuari added somewhat timidly that there were quite a few difficult and confusing books here, and she wasn't sure she could handle them. Hearing this, Lulubelle pointed to a colorful book with cute illustrations and asked her friend if she'd like to read it together. She also pointed out that the illustrations were very beautiful and that books like this usually had extremely simple and easy-to-follow plots. Surprised by the offer, Chuari said she would be delighted to read it. Then Lulubelle opened the very first page and began to read aloud an amazing, touching fairy tale. Chuari was moved to tears, noting that the story turned out to be very touching and beautiful, striking the deepest chords of her soul. As soon as the story reached its happy ending, she turned to her friend and asked, "What did you think of the story?" Smiling, Chuari sincerely admitted that she had found it very interesting to listen to, and that she had never before felt such warm emotions from reading. Looking around, Lulu Bell noted with delight that there were several other books in the store that had piqued her interest. Deciding to buy all the books they liked, the young people happily left the store with full bags. Watching the departing customers, the elderly shop owner fell deep in thought and mused aloud. I wonder if one of the books they bought will ever make its way back to the shelf? His young employee, completely baffled, asked, "Why on earth would a book ever come back?" The man then explained thoughtfully that this book devours the magical energy of anyone who dares to read it. It turned out that many powerful magicians had previously tried to read it to the end in order to test their strength. However, they all lost consciousness from complete exhaustion long before they reached the final pages. And when the reading is suddenly interrupted, the book magically returns to its shelf in the store in an instant, as if no one had ever bought it. The young employee asked his mentor in bewilderment, "Can we really sell such a dangerous item to unsuspecting customers?" The man then explained with a sly look that it was one of the best-selling and most popular items in the entire store. Still, the young man looked at the man skeptically and, pointing at Lulu Bell as she walked away, said that this elf had just read the entire book from cover to cover, without skipping a single page. The older man shouted loudly in shock, refusing to believe what he had heard. Meanwhile, the group of friends continued to stroll cheerfully through the city, wondering where else they could go and what interesting sights to see. That's when Bryn realized they'd already spent a lot of money on trendy clothes and expensive books. And now they had to figure out how to make the rest of their money last until their next assignment. And yet Bryn firmly believed that they simply had to spend a certain amount of money at the local casino to try their luck and possibly increase their capital. Sitting at the gaming table, he was shouting loudly. One of his female friends, noticing this, asked in bewilderment whether shouting really did increase his chances of winning. The guy replied confidently that it helped block all kinds of distractions and magical traps that the casino deliberately set up to distract players. Watching everything unfold from the sidelines, Lulu Bell remarked skeptically that one shouldn't trust people who are addicted to gambling. However, at that very moment, Bryn and Chuari both held their breath in anticipation. And the little ball, bouncing on a spinning wheel, landed exactly where it needed to. Bryn shouted joyfully across the room, calling himself the luckiest person in the whole wide world. And yet, Chuko, with a sly smile, pointed out that her friend had simply bet on the number Chuari had chosen, and he hadn't put any effort into it himself. Smiling, Lulu Bell also added that they would have preferred to watch their friend lose all his money rather than win it. Suddenly, a stranger rudely interrupted the lively conversation, armed with a sharp dagger. He demanded that they hand over all the winnings immediately. This insolent man believed that easy money won at the casino shouldn't belong to just one person. It should be shared with anyone who wanted some. However, Bryn strongly disapproved of this idea and firmly stated that if anyone wanted money, they should go out and earn it honestly, like a decent person, rather than taking it from others. Hearing this, Lulu Bell laughed out loud, fully aware that anyone could spout such noble sentiments, but certainly not her companion, who had just tried to beat the casino himself. The criminal said irritably that he wouldn't be able to earn such a large sum in such a short time. And, launching a threatening attack, he once again demanded that they hand over everything the group had. Without panicking for a second, Bryn deftly drew his gleaming sword from behind his back and confidently strode toward the thug. At that very moment, he darted past the criminal like lightning. Recovering from the shock, the assailant grabbed his blade, only to discover with horror that it had completely malfunctioned and shattered into pieces. With his trademark smile, Bryn reminded the stranger not to do anything foolish. Collapsing to the ground in helplessness, the man cursed loudly. And at that very moment, several frightened children ran up to him. The children anxiously called the stranger brother and asked if he'd managed to find the medicine. One of the older boys reported hopefully that he'd already gathered everything needed for the treatment. When the kids heard this heartbreaking story, they couldn't turn a blind eye to a stranger's misfortune, and despite Bryn's best efforts to keep the winnings, the funds were ultimately donated to the family in need. After a few hours of an eventful day, the young people finally returned to Faith, who had already finished his business at the guild. A delighted Chuko gave her friend a big hug. She told him she was incredibly happy to see him and had missed him all this time. Lulu Bell enthusiastically recounted that there were plenty of interesting and amazing things in this city, and they'd had a lot of fun exploring. Danshua also mentioned that the girls had shown her many incredible things she hadn't even imagined before. Chuko mentioned that they bought a lot of things and spent almost all their money, while Bryn, as expected, was planning to spend his money right away on gambling. Looking at his boisterous but dear friends, the protagonist realized he'd worried for nothing about possible arguments and fights within the team. Smiling, Faith announced that they were leaving for the Empire first thing tomorrow morning, and for that reason, they should get plenty of rest and recharge their energy before this important mission. At the same time, In a distant empire, a group of mysterious adventurers posed a direct question to the commander of the Imperial Knights. Why was he deceiving innocent warriors and luring them into a deadly trap without warning them of the true danger? Bowing before the unknown and powerful being, Mikhail respectfully announced that everyone was already assembled, and he would quickly prepare fresh recruits for the Lord to bolster the ranks of his army. Meanwhile, Bren was screaming loudly and begged to be let down to the ground quickly. But his loyal friends continued to tease him good-naturedly, demonstrating their impressive ability to fly without any magic. Laughing heartily, Lulubelle asked with a mischievous smile, "Does the young man really want to be let go right now?" Seeing the terrifying distance to solid ground below, Bren instantly calmed down and hastily said he didn't want to fall from such a height at all. Then Chuko chimed in and said seriously that he should be patient a little longer, since they were almost there. At that very moment, the protagonist announced loudly that he could already see the majestic borders of the Empire's capital. As he strolled through the bustling, noisy streets, he looked around with interest at the Empire of Comoria. Lulubelle also explained admiringly that the streets here were very beautiful and well-maintained, the likes of which she hadn't seen in a long time. Following his companions, Bren felt that his legs were still completely wobbly from the intense stress he'd experienced during this unusual air journey. With her kind smile, Lulubelle turned to Faith and asked if their mission was to rid such wonderful and beautiful places of the dangerous monster terrorizing the surrounding area. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, she also learned that if they were victorious, they were guaranteed to receive an S rank in the guild, a prospect that couldn't help but delight the young, ambitious girl. And yet, Faith pointed out that the city didn't look at all like a place that had been severely damaged by the monster's attacks. Chuko then suggested that the monster hadn't struck yet. Still, Faith firmly stated that in order to get to the bottom of things and obtain accurate information, they needed to meet with the client in person, namely, the commander of the Knights. Upon arriving at the majestic castle, the group politely greeted the commander, and Chuko apologized for disturbing him at such a late hour. However, Mikhail kindly replied that he was glad the young people had found the time to come on such an important matter. After introducing himself in full, the commander of the Imperial Knights shook the protagonist's hand firmly. Then Faith also introduced himself and explained that they had arrived on behalf of the guild to defeat a dangerous monster. At that moment, the rest of the team also politely introduced themselves and stated their names to observe all formalities. After giving the group of adventurers a careful once-over, Mikhail asked whether Faith was the leader of the party mentioned in the documents. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, he gestured toward the nearest door and said they could begin discussing all the necessary details right away behind closed doors. Mikhail also clarified that he needed to share all the important information, which was not meant for prying ears, with the soldiers. Upon hearing this, Faith was slightly taken aback, realizing that he would have to participate in a full-fledged military council, just like a real commander. Once inside the lavishly furnished room, Mikhail warned that while the finest imperial tea, prepared according to a special recipe, was being brewed, the young men would need to wait a little while and be patient. When a fragrant tea was ceremoniously served, Bren and the rest of the young men warmly thanked the commander for the great honor and hospitality. Watching the scene unfold, the commander of the Imperial Knights apologized that the conference room was too small for such a large group. At that moment, the protagonist politely asked his friends to wait for him in the room for a moment while he discussed the details in private with the commander. He walked down a long, gloomy corridor. Once he was in the other room, Mikhail explained that the monster that had attacked the Empire and mentioned in the quest calls itself Rob. Upon hearing this simple and short name, Faith thought to himself that it didn't sound nearly as serious or terrifying as the Wanderer of Darkness they had recently fought. And yet, with a grim expression, Mikhail replied that this Rob had proven to be such a strong and ruthless opponent that even the renowned Imperial Order of Knights had been unable to give him a proper rebuff. Recalling the bustling city streets they had just seen, Faith noted in bewilderment that, despite this, the capital looked completely untouched and thriving. The commander sighed and explained that instead of destroying the city and mindlessly kidnapping innocent people, Rob had offered the knights a strange deal and set certain conditions that they were forced to accept. After asking for clarification with skepticism, the protagonist paused, waiting for further explanation. Mikhail, his face grim and impassive, recounted that Rob had demanded that the Knights of the Empire regularly hand over living people to him as sacrifices. Upon hearing this, Faith froze in place, unable to believe his ears. At that moment, his heart sinking, he asked whether the ordinary citizens of the Empire were suffering as a result of such a horrific agreement. Mikhail replied in the negative. He firmly stated that sacrificing innocent citizens for the sake of defending the country was utterly absurd and made absolutely no sense from a moral standpoint. After a brief, tense pause, he coldly stated that they had no choice but to hand over to the monster precisely those adventurers who came to the Empire in search of work and glory. At that very moment, in the next room, a real ambush was being prepared for the unsuspecting young men who were peacefully enjoying fragrant tea in the conference room, unaware of the betrayal. Looking Faith straight in the eye, Mikhail declared that all of this was being done solely for the sake of the great empire and the welfare of its people. Activating a powerful spell, he asked the young man with cold politeness not to hold a grudge against them for this forced betrayal. The protagonist realized too late that his opponent had used the dangerous spells Blinding Darkness and Beam of Glory simultaneously. This powerful attack completely blinded him, and even with his unique ability to foresee the future, he was completely unable to focus on what was happening. Losing consciousness, Faith fell heavily onto the cold stone floor. Mikhail, in a calm voice, told him not to worry, since the monster Rob only wanted living people. At that very moment, Bryn looked with a contemptuous smirk at the knights surrounding them on all sides and wondered if they were seriously thinking they could carry out their treacherous plan against such experienced fighters. Stepping one step closer, one of the stone-faced warriors announced that the arriving guests would become the next victims in the name of the Empire's prosperity and security. And for that very reason, the young people must surrender immediately without a fight. At that very moment, Shuari, sniffing at the empty cups, figured it out and announced that this was most likely the reason the tea had been secretly poisoned with some slow-acting toxin. Smiling coquettishly with her signature expression, Chuko playfully remarked that knights were not monsters, and they themselves surely did not want to die at their hands. Furthermore, Danshua calmly stated that she was unable to fully control her destructive powers when she sensed a threat. However, the knights were clearly skeptical of the hero's strength, and for this reason, they sternly warned that if the heroes put up active resistance, they shouldn't count on a peaceful and bloodless resolution to this conflict. With a sly smile on her face, Lulu Bell casually pointed out that they were merely going to brush the dust off their clothes, and that this in no way constituted resistance or aggression. At the same time, the protagonist slowly regained consciousness and began frantically trying to figure out exactly where he was and how he had ended up in this dark place. He then decided to ask his opponent, Mikhail, directly why he had been dragged here. Mikhail replied coldly that Faith was on the ancient altar, where all the captured victims were being handed over to the monster Rob. Staring straight ahead with a vacant gaze, he also explained that very soon all of Faith's other comrades would be brought here to share his fate. Enraged to the core, the protagonist loudly declared that he was deeply outraged by the outrageous fact that the knights, who, by the duty of their office, were supposed to defend their country, were unceremoniously betraying and selling adventurers to the monster. One of the guards tried to justify himself, replying that they simply had no other choice and had no option but to obey the monster's demands, otherwise it would destroy the entire city. And yet Faith firmly stated that he had no intention of believing such foolish and pathetic excuses. It was simply cowardice and betrayal of the highest order. Standing nearby, Mikhail coldly emphasized that all of this was strictly his own decision as commander, and that Faith had nothing to worry about except his own fate. Deeply upset, the protagonist mentally berated himself, realizing that he had foolishly fallen into the criminal's hands by trusting the first person he met. However, he took some comfort in the thought that they weren't planning to kill him right away. Besides, Faith hoped that very soon Bryn and the rest of his loyal friends would come to his rescue and get him out of this mess. But at that very moment, he realized the full tragedy of the situation, for his friends, too, were trapped. Faith pondered deeply whether he was really behaving like a true OP right now. He didn't understand why he was still hoping for someone's help and continuing to be deceived by people just like this hypocritical commander. And yet the protagonist firmly understood that even if he wasn't particularly strong physically on his own, he had to stand his ground until the very end and never surrender to the enemy under any circumstances. Gathering all his willpower and breaking free from his tight shackles, he realized that his true path lay in never giving up, no matter how many times he fell. Seeing this, Mikhail was genuinely angered, and, to his surprise, noted that he was impressed by such willpower and surmised that the young man had managed to break free from his bonds thanks to some hidden divine blessing. With his warm smile, Faith calmly remarked that his goddess was very different from the one in whom the commander and his knights believed. Not understanding a single word of what this strange fellow was saying, Mikhail warily drew his gleaming sword from its sheath, and he warned that, in any case, Faith wouldn't be able to escape from here anyway, even if he managed to free himself from the ropes. And yet Faith firmly emphasized that he didn't know whether the story was actually true. But he was absolutely certain of one thing. Everyone present in that hall had made a huge and irreparable mistake. Narrowing his eyes with curiosity and anger, Mikhail coldly asked what exactly they had done wrong, in the opinion of this cocky young man. Then the protagonist boldly admitted that the knights had made an enemy of a man who was, in fact, far stronger and more dangerous than the monster they so obediently served. Hearing this, the guards exchanged puzzled glances, completely at a loss as to what exactly Faith was talking about. Suddenly, a breathless man burst into the hall. He excitedly informed the commander that one of the adventurers had launched a solo attack and was already wreaking havoc among the guards. The frightened warriors fled in panic down the long corridor, trying either to escape pursuit or to reach their commander in search of protection. Lulu Bell, hot on their heels, laughed merrily, reminding them that the knights were trembling with fear, even though they themselves had chosen to play dangerous games with powerful opponents. At that very moment, the protagonist, with a growing sense of confidence, declared that the time had come to take his long-awaited revenge, and that he would personally deal with Mikhail before anyone else reached that hall. However, the commander quickly gave a clear order to his knights to immediately capture the fleeing adventurer at any cost. As soon as the order was given, the knights reacted instantly and rushed to carry out their commander's orders. Mikhail also told them as he left that he would quickly subdue this insolent young man himself and would soon join them to complete the ritual. Sometime later, Mikhail pinned Faith firmly against the cold stone wall. Looking down at his captive from his vantage point, he coldly informed him that he would no longer be able to move as nimbly and quickly as before, and that any attempts to escape would be futile. And yet, the protagonist declared defiantly that they could try fighting one more time, and the outcome would surely be different. Moreover, he admitted bitterly that he had boasted pompously about his incredible strength, only to lose almost instantly, and this awkward situation seemed extremely humiliating to him. Turning toward the exit, Mikhail explained with icy composure that no matter how hard he tried, the result would remain the same, and Faith had no chance of winning. He also coldly asked the protagonist to simply behave calmly and obediently, without causing any unnecessary trouble. After leaving the room, Mikhail began to think about the need to gather all the other adventurers in one place to perform the ritual. And yet, he recalled with bewilderment that he had sent a large number of his best soldiers to the guest room, and he had absolutely no idea what could have happened during his brief absence. At that moment, Mikhail began to get truly angry, realizing that if he didn't manage to gather the entire group soon, the lady would be extremely angry and dissatisfied with his work. Suddenly, a girl in the guise of Cat, who had appeared from the shadows, called out to him. She reminded him that, according to the contract, there must be at least 4 living people for the ritual to be complete. Stunned by Lady Rob's presence, Mikhail immediately bowed his head respectfully, not daring to look up at her. At that moment, the protagonist took a closer look at the mysterious monster. He realized that this humanoid cat was a powerful demon, since it could speak and think like a human. He also couldn't believe that an entire renowned order of knights had been unable to do anything against a single entity, even if it was very powerful. And yet Mikhail began to humbly beg the lady's forgiveness, kneeling before her and promising that he would definitely deliver all the adventurers straight to the altar safe and sound as soon as possible. With a predatory smile, Rob languidly remarked that there was nothing to worry about regarding the absence of the people, since they could always be easily replaced by the Imperial Knights themselves, of whom the castle was full. Unable to believe what he'd heard, the commander fell to his knees once more and, in a trembling voice, begged the lady to stop and not to do this to his men. At that moment, Rob glided almost right up to the man, informing him that if he didn't like that turn of events, they could simply take ordinary locals from the nearby streets. As soon as the monster moved back to a safe distance from him, Mikhail began to sob quietly out of horror and fear of losing his men, whom he had sworn to protect. Glancing into the hall, Rob saw Faith, who was firmly pinned to the wall and couldn't move. Smiling her sly smile, she lazily remarked that she hadn't even noticed him when she entered, so inconspicuous was he. Then the protagonist asked point-blank why the commander was trembling so violently in Rob's presence, and whether she was really so powerful that he couldn't defy her. Laughing in response with a ringing laugh, the girl playfully said that she certainly couldn't be called a cute little kitten, and flattery would definitely not help the young man escape his fate. Realizing the gravity and hopelessness of the situation, the commander understood that since a peaceful resolution had failed, he would have to take an almost desperate step. Using the Ray of Glory spell at full power, he directed all his accumulated energy straight at Rob, hoping to catch her off guard. Thanks to his vision of the future skill, the protagonist knew in advance that this desperate attack would not succeed and would only enrage the monster. Rob did indeed manage to dodge the attack in a flash, defying Mikhail's bold and naive expectations, leaving him completely bewildered. Enraged to the core, Rob asked maliciously and menacingly, "What just happened?" She rushed toward Mikhail and shoved him against the wall with such incredible force that he nearly lost consciousness from the violent impact. Noticing that the commander had sustained serious physical injuries and was barely able to stand, she said with feigned regret that she had indeed tried to restrain her monstrous strength and had not at all wanted the man to be sent flying so far with a single blow. Turning to Faith, Rob explained in an icy tone that this was precisely why she had asked the commander to find people for her ritual. At that moment, Faith suddenly managed to break free from the wall, and as he looked at the defeated Mikhail, he realized that this creature was so powerful that it had been able to completely incapacitate the commander with a single blow. As he swung to counterattack, he knew that if he could defeat this dangerous monster, he would attain a rank far higher than anything the commander had ever held. However, his bold attack was unsuccessful, and Faith felt a burning, sharp pain on his face. Laughing at his naivety, Rob asked with genuine curiosity why this foolish young man had decided to undertake such a rash and doomed to failure act. Moreover, she dismissively pointed out that Faith wasn't even close to Mikhail in terms of strength and experience, and he had absolutely no chance of defeating her. However, the protagonist was extremely frustrated that Rob's speed was too fast for him to keep up with her movements, even with his ability to predict the future. Meanwhile, Rob stood before the young people, berating herself for once again failing to restrain her incredible power. Turning to Mikhail, she coldly asked if he was still alive. Suddenly, a strong, gusty wind swept through the room. It made everyone squint, and a few moments later, Rob leaped onto the ceiling, and Lulu Bell entered the room solemnly, with a proud bearing. The first thing Lulu Bell did was ask her grandfather if he was all right and if he needed urgent help. And yet, the girl watched everything that was happening with a slight question in her eyes. Had she arrived too late for the start of the performance? Upon seeing his beloved relative, the main character was genuinely delighted, and with a touch of self-deprecating humor, he told her that if his back hadn't been acting up, he would have definitely defeated this Rob all by himself. Meanwhile, Rob was sitting up near the ceiling in the far corner. Spotting Lulu Bell, she asked curiously, "Is this yet another of her future victims who's come to meet her certain doom?" On top of that, she ominously explained that this time she would definitely try to restrain herself. At that very moment, Rob directed a massive amount of her monstrous magical power straight at Lulu Bell, hoping to destroy her with a single blow. However, to everyone's sincere surprise, Lulu Bell managed to withstand the attack and suffer no damage at all, using a powerful magical shield that completely absorbed the attack. Astonished by this young adventurer's incredible abilities, Ms. Rob asked whether she possessed some kind of divine blessing. Lulu Bell then proudly pointed out that it was not divine grace or a blessing from above at all, but the most ordinary magic, which anyone could master with enough dedication. Stunned by this statement, Rob said in bewilderment that, as far as she knew, using magic required special magical items and knowledge of specific spells that had to be spoken aloud. As she drew closer to the monster with every step, Lulu Bell explained in a mysterious voice that her spell had long been resonating in every step she took and every movement of her hands, and that no words were needed for it. As soon as the girl finished speaking, she directed all her accumulated magical power toward the monster, unleashing a barrage of energy upon it. The sound was so loud and deafening that all the townspeople near the castle heard it, and many ran out into the streets in fear. Mikhail and Faith stared spellbound straight ahead, unable to take their eyes off what was happening. Rob was genuinely surprised as she watched Lulu Bell's incredible power. She knew full well that with such a strong and rapid condensation of magical spells, when movements replace words, the magic might simply fail to work. Then, with a predatory grin, Rob announced that in that case, she would no longer hold back her true power, as she had done before. After that, Rob coldly told Lulu Bell to prepare for a brutal and merciless battle. Covering her head with her hands for protection, Lulu Bell hastily created a sturdy magical shield and found herself beneath a glass dome that was supposed to protect her from blows. However, at that very moment, Rob dealt devastating and very serious physical damage to Lulu Bell, piercing through her defenses. Seeing this, the protagonist lunged forward, desperate to save his precious relative from a past life, who had become so dear to him. Rob severed the girl's arm with a single swift motion, and later, with a mocking smile, she handed the severed limb back to its owner. However, Rob's efforts were completely in vain, as a moment later Lulu Bell was standing before her again without any visible wounds and with both arms intact, as if nothing had happened. In a calm voice, she remarked that, apparently, she had slightly underestimated the fighting abilities of this cunning cat. Rob immediately noticed that a new, perfectly healthy hand had grown in place of her opponent's, and, in shock, she screamed loudly, unable to believe her eyes. With her warm smile, Lulubelle explained that her primary specialty was the use of powerful healing magic, which she had studied for many years. Moreover, she noted with a touch of pride that regrowing a severed arm was child's play for her. Looking at the girl with admiration and a touch of envy, Faith realized that his own ability to regenerate didn't even come close to her phenomenal ability to heal not only herself but others as well. Standing before the half-ruined walls, which had miraculously remained standing after the battle, Lulubelle firmly declared that she would no longer hold back when it came to dealing damage. And Rob must be prepared for the most serious and irreversible consequences of her aggression. A moment later, Lulubelle confidently cast her silent spell once more and launched a swift, unpredictable attack without a sound. In a vast hall, the only sounds to be heard were the rhythmic clicks of her heels as she marched, and absolutely nothing else. However, Lulubelle managed to cast a spell so powerful and destructive that Rob didn't even know how to properly defend herself against such an invisible threat. At that very moment, she felt excruciating physical pain throughout her body and let out a barely audible cry, trying to stifle her scream. As she lost consciousness from the pain shock, Rob realized with horror that Lulubelle was casting a huge number of spells at once, and she was unleashing them one after another at an incredible speed. She clearly remembered that the shorter the spell, the less magical power it should have. But this amazing elf's power wasn't diminishing at all. On the contrary, with each spell, it only increased exponentially. Closing her eyes in utter exhaustion, Rob honestly admitted to herself that she really couldn't do anything else against such an opponent, and that it was time to give up. Winking at the young people with her mischievous eye, Lulubelle turned to them with ease, informing them that this dangerous monster was finally defeated and they could breathe a sigh of relief. As she looked down at her defeated rival, who lay unconscious on the cold floor, Lulubelle stood there smiling as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just been in a life-or-death battle. Getting up from the ground, the protagonist slowly approached the girl and said with a warm smile that he hadn't expected anything less from her. Laughing in response with a ringing laugh, she casually remarked that it had been easier than easy and she hadn't even broken a sweat. Noticing the fresh wounds on the young man's face from the recent battle, Lulubelle said kindly that she would heal them right away and began to channel her gentle magical power, which flowed from her hands. The protagonist watched in utter amazement as his damaged skin healed right before his eyes, leaving only a pleasant warmth. Winking at him with her signature gesture, Lulubelle proudly explained that she had been studying healing magic diligently and selflessly for the past few years, and that it was now her strongest and most developed skill. Thanking her from the bottom of his heart, Faith sincerely explained that he was so deeply moved that he simply couldn't find the right words to express his gratitude. Moreover, he recalled with a touch of nostalgia that when Lulubelle was still a little girl and had just begun to learn magic, she was completely unable to control her unbridled mana, and for that reason, their house had blown up dozens of times, much to the horror of their neighbors. However, Lulubelle immediately asked him not to bring up her childhood and teenage mistakes, and especially not to remind her of what had happened dozens of years ago, when she was still learning. Apologizing for his chattiness, Faith began to reflect on the fact that his granddaughter was a true genius, since she used fluid body movements instead of the long and complex spells that take years to learn. Brushing off his words, Lulubelle said with a touch of embarrassment that, aside from healing, she was still much weaker than her mother in every other respect. That was precisely why she had expected even more praise and recognition of her achievements from her relative. And yet the protagonist gave her a thumbs up, telling her that she had seriously and very timely come to his rescue in this difficult situation and that he would never forget it. Laughing heartily, Lulubelle said that she was always ready, at any moment, to perform such feats for the sake of her loved ones. Enveloping her relative in a warm embrace, Lulubelle explained with deep feeling that he could count on her completely and unconditionally in any situation. Then Faith said with a touch of sadness that he felt a little awkward that his granddaughter was always saving him, while he couldn't return the favor. However, Lulubelle firmly assured him that Faith had absolutely no reason to worry about that. After all, in this unfamiliar world, they're the only family members who truly cherish one another. After a while, Rob slowly came to from a deep faint, completely confused by what was happening around her. Standing up on wobbly legs, she was puzzled to discover that all her terrible wounds had completely vanished without a trace, as if they had never existed. Then Lulubelle, with a kind smile, explained that she had healed her defeated rival, and even the old, long-standing scars on her body had vanished forever. Not understanding the motivation behind helping an enemy she had just defeated, Rob asked with genuine curiosity, "Why would you do that?" Stepping closer to Rob, The elf declared in a firm voice that she had accumulated quite a few important and pressing questions for Rob, to which she demanded honest answers. With a sweet and disarming smile and a twinkle in her eyes, she asked if the girl would be willing to answer them right now of her own free will. Standing before the defeated Rob, the protagonist asked with a stern expression why she needed innocent victims and why the criminal had been holding people captive. After thinking for a moment and gathering her thoughts, Rob calmly replied that many years ago, people had stolen a secret treasure of the demons, namely, an ancient magical mask possessing incredible power. The reason for that theft was the idea of creating an exact copy of it to use for their own purposes. However, Rob didn't know all the details of that case. Since she was merely a foot soldier, she immediately and honestly told the guys this. In addition, she pointed out that she was just a rank and file member of the organization behind all these abductions. At that moment, Faith realized with alarm that if Rob, who was so powerful and dangerous, was merely a rank-and-file employee, then things were looking extremely dire and serious trials lay ahead for them. And yet the villainess pointed out that, apparently, the demons needed living test subjects to recreate a secret mask that had been lost many centuries ago. She also noted that the creatures had wanted to test the magical artifact on ordinary people and had acted so cruelly until all their experiments failed miserably. Then Lulu Bell turned to Rob with an important question, asking whether the kidnapped adventurers might still be alive. Nodding in agreement, Rob explained that such a scenario was entirely possible, provided that the cruel experiment hadn't yet begun on them. The protagonist then firmly stated that he understood everything perfectly well, and that all further details should be discussed with the guild leadership. He also asked Lulu Bell to contact Rob. Just as Lulu Bell and Faith were about to leave the scene of the brutal battle, they suddenly heard Mikhail's voice. He was terrified that he, too, would now be arrested for aiding and abetting. The wounded and exhausted commander asked plaintively whether the guys should take him along for questioning. Turning toward his voice, the protagonist looked questioningly at the exhausted adventurer and coldly asked, "For what reason on earth should we even take him with us?" Weeping from helplessness and shame, the man honestly admitted that he had previously committed a serious crime and had once again deceived the adventurers who had trusted him, for which he must be punished. Explaining that this was the absolute truth and that he wasn't looking for excuses, the protagonist waved his hand wearily and said he didn't care about his confession. Moreover, he noted with a touch of sadness that the adventurers who had failed to defeat the commander last time would certainly have been powerless against Rob and would have perished. However, Faith emphasized that, fortunately, those adventurers had survived thanks to a stroke of luck, and the commander of the Imperial Knights, in his personal opinion, was simply defending his country and doing what he could in a hopeless situation. At the same time, he generously announced that he could turn a blind eye to the minor misunderstanding that had occurred earlier and would not file a complaint with the guild. Smiling his trademark smile, Faith added that if the matter turned out to be too tedious and bureaucratic, he'd simply be too lazy to write long reports with detailed explanations of everything that had happened. Taken aback by such an unexpected statement, Lulu Bell asked whether her friend was serious or just joking. Answering in the affirmative and with conviction, the protagonist turned around and, together with Lulu Bell, headed toward the exit, bidding the commander a friendly farewell. Watching the departing young man with immense respect, Mikhail could not believe that he was looking at ordinary adventurers rather than the legendary heroes of antiquity. At that very moment, he rose from the cold ground and bowed deeply, thanking them for saving his life and the entire kingdom from certain doom. A few hours later, one of the breathless warriors entered the guild building and excitedly asked his friend for Faith's exact whereabouts. When it became clear that the young man was currently on an important imperial mission, the adventurer produced a sealed letter, stating that Faith absolutely had to be made aware of its contents. Looking at the sheet of paper containing the important information, the man proudly declared that they had always relied on Lavi as their strongest fighter, but now they had a far more powerful warrior, namely, Faith. Nodding his head in full agreement, and as a sign of support, the second adventurer eagerly declared that he simply couldn't wait for the inter-guild competitions to see his idol in action. The girl at the reception desk congratulated Faith with genuine joy on her safe return from the Imperial mission. She also firmly stated that they would definitely find out exactly where the kidnapped adventurers were, since this was a matter of honor for the entire guild, and they wouldn't rest until they found every single one of them. In response to these words, Faith firmly declared that he also wished to stay informed about the entire investigation and, if possible, provide any assistance that might be needed. The polite young woman also asked that the special restraining magic not be removed from the Demoness, so that her incredible powers could be kept in check for the duration of the search for the missing adventurers. Faith fully agreed with this wise suggestion, noting that it would be much better and more peaceful for everyone involved. At the same time, he thought to himself that he would definitely need to pass this important information on to Lulu Bell, who was in charge of the magical restraints. At that moment, the attentive administrator handed the young man a brand new, shiny card and solemnly announced that he was now officially an S rank holder. After receiving warm congratulations and the coveted rank, the protagonist was overjoyed, and unable to contain his emotions, he let out a loud cry of joy that echoed throughout the guild. The adventurers around him congratulated the young man in unison and sincerely wished him as many victories and achievements as possible on the difficult path ahead. And yet, one of the veteran warriors present in the guild asked whether Faith would be participating in the upcoming competitions, since everyone was counting on him heavily as their greatest hope. After giving the question a moment's thought, Faith confidently stated that the time was right for such events and that he had no intention of letting this opportunity slip away. Furthermore, it turned out that this time, everything would take place in a picturesque duchy, specifically in the beautiful city of flowers on the fertile lands of Flaxed. However, Faith knew absolutely nothing about this place, since previous competitions had always been held at the training ground right next to the guild. The experienced man explained that during the Great War against the demons, the powerful Flax family had acquired a legendary mask, and whoever dared to wear it would gain power beyond the bounds of ordinary human understanding. Furthermore, there were persistent rumors that during a decisive battle, the head of the family had donned this mask and single-handedly defeated thousands of demons, putting them to flight. Surprised by this information, the protagonist recalled that this was most likely the ancient artifact Rob had been referring to in their conversation. He pondered deeply that if he managed to obtain this mask of supremacy, he himself could become the true OP he had always dreamed of since his very first day in this world. Chuckling to himself at these thoughts, Faith inadvertently overheard a conversation at the neighboring table, where a group of adventurers was heatedly discussing why such a valuable artifact was being put up for public auction. One of them suggested that it was just another one of the rich people's whims. At that very moment, the young man spotted Lavi, who had just walked into the guild to attend to some urgent business. Running up to her with hope in his eyes, Faith excitedly asked if she was participating in the upcoming competitions, and if so, he desperately wanted to train with her. However, Lavi coldly informed him that she had no intention of participating in any competitions this year. Stunned by this unexpected news, the young man asked in bewilderment why an experienced warrior would refuse to participate. Lavi then replied with contempt that a regular tournament combined with honest training was one thing, but a meaningless pastime for the arrogant nobility was quite another. Still, the protagonist pointed out that this year's competition would take place in a completely new format, a team of 3 adventurers against another 3, and in his firm opinion, without Lavi, they simply couldn't win. However, the warrior then remarked skeptically that even with her on the team, they still wouldn't be able to win. Noticing the young man's surprised look, Lavi explained seriously that SS-ranked adventurers will be participating in this grand competition. Lavi explained, with obvious bitterness in her voice, that in the past, those arrogant warriors and haughty nobles hadn't even wanted to hear about such competitions. But as soon as the scale and the prize pool grew, everyone immediately decided to sign up. She felt with disgust that such hypocritical people, who only show up when success is a sure thing, were extremely unpleasant and unworthy of respect. Leaving the bustling guild hall, the warrior gave her friend some wise advice. He, too, should refrain from participating in these sordid competitions this time around. Then, as they parted ways, the young man asked in bewilderment, "Is that really a valid reason to refuse to participate?" He passionately declared that, in his personal opinion, this was an excellent opportunity to teach those arrogant adventurers a lesson, those who thought too highly of themselves and looked down on others. Moreover, Faith confidently emphasized that if they managed to defeat them in a fair fight, they would gain incredible fame throughout the guild, and if they managed to obtain the coveted mask of supremacy, they would surely become invincible warriors. After shouting out his arguments with great enthusiasm, the young man exhaled deeply and asked, "Is all of this really not enough for Lavi to change his mind?" With the most encouraging smile, he reminded them that they were, first and foremost, adventurers, and they certainly shouldn't be afraid of the dangers and setbacks that lay ahead. Turning around, the protagonist was surprised to see his jubilant companions behind him, who happily supported his opinion and nodded in agreement. And yet he exclaimed with delight that it was simply astonishing that the grand prize of the competition was an ancient relic of the Flaxed family, that very legendary mask of supremacy. The young man explained in detail that this powerful artifact allows legendary-level adventurers to become even stronger and match the power of Bryn or Lulu Bell, who have already reached incredible heights. After listening to him, Lavi coldly informed him, her face as stone, that he could set off on his own adventures, but without her. Trying to stop his departing friend, Faith explained excitedly that he wanted to do this not for fame or money, but for the sake of those adventurers who had previously been brutally kidnapped by demons. The warrior stopped dead in her tracks. Then she slowly turned around and asked, "What exactly did you just say, young man?" Faith then honestly explained that the dangerous demonists they had fought in the Empire had been abducting innocent people in order to recreate a lost magical mask. As the young man surmised, this might be the very same ancient artifact that had been obtained back during the time of the First Great War between humans and demons. In the young man's firm opinion, they could obtain this mask at the competition and then trade it to the demon organization in exchange for all the kidnapped people. Moreover, he understood perfectly well that this was the only real way to save all the unfortunate souls languishing in captivity. After a brief pause to consider what she had heard, Lavi, with a serious expression, noted that she really hoped this wasn't a lie just to lure them into the tournament. Raising his hands in a gesture of honesty, Faith began vehemently denying that he had ever lied to her, and as irrefutable proof, he suggested they visit the dungeon right then and there, where Rob was being held captive under heavy guard. Realizing they simply had no other choice if they wanted to save the people, the warrior finally agreed to participate in the competition, albeit very reluctantly. However, she firmly and sternly emphasized that in that case, they would definitely have to win at any cost, because defeat would mean death for many innocent people. Sometime later, gazing at the majestic city with its elegant spires and marble facades, the protagonist remarked with admiration that, as expected of the capital of the Flax domain, both the people and the buildings here looked incredibly luxurious and opulent. Lavi noted carefully that adventurers from other distant cities were also flocking to the prestigious competition, and the competition would be fierce. Still, Faith asked with a hint of concern about the exact whereabouts of the third member of their group, whom they hadn't seen yet. Lavi calmly explained that Nakaru was supposed to be traveling in a different carriage, and they had agreed in advance to meet her directly at the tournament venue, so there was no need to worry. In that case, as Faith rightly pointed out, it was time for them to hurry to the arena, so they wouldn't be late for the start of registration. One of the members of the other team also loudly marveled at the vast grounds, noting the truly impressive size of the place, which he had never seen before. On top of that, this boisterous guy with a silly grin explained that these vast territories could easily accommodate thousands of enormous dragons if they all suddenly decided to land at once. Duster's fair-haired friend asked him in exasperation to shut up immediately, pointing out that his silly antics were embarrassing them all in front of the other participants with his inappropriate behavior. The third member of their team, a bald man with a stern face, also told both adventurers to be quiet, since they were representing their renowned guild and could not afford such shameful and childish behavior in public. The angry blonde sharply told her bald companion to put on a decent shirt first before arguing and lecturing them on manners. The man then proudly explained that the beauty of his bulging muscles was the best and most effective advertisement for their guild, and he had no intention of hiding such a treasure. And yet such a self-assured response did not satisfy the young lady at all, and she turned to her companions with an urgent request to enter the arena as soon as possible, before they were completely disgraced. Pointing with a trembling finger at the enormous line of warriors stretching 100 meters, she said in despair that they had argued and gotten distracted for too long, and now an impenetrable crowd of participants had formed right in front of them. Pointing his finger at the clear blue sky, Duster said with a mischievous gleam in his eyes that they had no choice but to make their way to the arena from above, using their unique skills. All the warriors standing in a long line looked up in surprise, and they saw 3 adventurers flying swiftly through the air above them. It turned out that one of the legendary martial arts of the renowned Silver Fist Guild is the air strike, which allows one to move through the void. The adventurer delivers lightning-fast strikes against the air itself, which an ordinary person cannot touch, thereby creating a foothold for flight. Incredible speed, colossal strength, and supreme skill, combined with this unique ability, gave him a significant advantage in any battle. The admiring crowd below whispered excitedly, noting that the legendary Silver Fist Guild was ranked among the greatest and most powerful guilds in the entire empire. Watching the backs of the young people rapidly receding into the distance, everyone looked with great respect at Duster, an SS, rank adventurer about whom legends were told. Finally finding the right registration desk, the young man confidently headed in the right direction. But suddenly, he was knocked off his feet by someone with incredible strength. Falling to the cold ground in surprise, he began looking around in utter bewilderment, trying to figure out what had just happened. After politely apologizing for the collision, Nakaru asked with genuine concern if the young man she had accidentally knocked down was all right. At the same time, she sheepishly admitted that she hadn't even considered the possibility that anyone other than herself would also be flying through the sky at such a busy time. Generously forgiving the flustered girl, Duster also politely asked if he had accidentally hurt her during their sudden mid-air collision. With her gentle smile, Nakura happily assured him that she was perfectly fine and hadn't even suffered a bruise. Watching this astonishing incident from the sidelines, the rest of the Silver Fist band members were genuinely shocked that this fragile girl had collided with Duster with such force that he couldn't dodge her, yet she hadn't received a single scratch. Looking at her new acquaintance with great admiration, Duster asked with genuine interest whether she was an adventurer and which guild she belonged to. Shrugging her shoulders in indecision, Nakuru honestly admitted that she didn't know exactly how to describe herself in this situation. After that, the young man gallantly introduced himself, and he announced with excitement that the girl truly possessed some incredible hidden power that he absolutely wanted to test. Spreading his arms wide in an inviting gesture, he stood right in the middle of the bustling square and loudly demanded that she fight him right here and now. Stunned by such audacity, his blonde partner had absolutely no idea why her friend was proposing a fight even before the official start of the competition. Descending to the ground using his martial arts skills, the bald man from their team thoughtfully pointed out that Duster very rarely showed such keen interest in anyone, and that this spectacle was worth seeing. However, the blonde couldn't care less about his opinion, and she resolutely approached her friend with a firm reminder that they were supposed to check in, not get into street fights. Remembering this, Duster said with a hint of disappointment that, as a final gesture, he'd like to test his new acquaintance's strength a little before they parted ways ahead of the tournament. After that, he boldly suggested she inflict any physical damage on him, promising he wouldn't defend himself. However, the blonde had absolutely no idea what was motivating her foolish companion, or why on earth he was asking to be hit. Then Duster, with a sly smile, explained that this way they'd be done much sooner and everyone would be happy. Addressing Nakuru directly, the guy defiantly declared that he wanted to find out firsthand just how strong this mysterious young woman really was. The blonde was even more furious at such recklessness and literally tried to drag her friend away from the noisy square, begging him not to do anything stupid in front of everyone. And yet Nakuru decided to carry out his strange request, landing just one cautious blow on the guy without putting her full strength into it. In the very next instant, Duster was sent flying several dozen meters with a deafening crash, smashing through the stone walls in his path and kicking up clouds of dust. Nakuru herself was genuinely surprised at just how incredibly powerful her blow had been. She clearly hadn't expected such a devastating effect. Feeling somewhat awkward and embarrassed by the destruction, she hurriedly said goodbye and explained that she had to go check in. All the members of the renowned band Silver Fist were deeply astonished, not expecting such monstrous and unbelievable strength from a girl who looked so ordinary. Getting up from the ground and brushing the dust off his torn clothes, Duster let out a loud shout of pure joy and delight. He admitted that he hadn't suspected beforehand that there would be such incredibly strong competitors in this tournament, and he was overjoyed that he had decided to participate after all, despite his doubts. On top of that, the adventurer, his eyes ablaze, announced that if they were to face the Nakura Guild in the final, he wanted to stay in the arena one-on-one with this amazing girl. And yet his blonde partner sternly reminded him that he had no right to let his guard down and make such foolish mistakes in a real battle. It could cost him his life. Not wanting to listen to her crazy friend's victory cry any longer, she sharply told him to shut up immediately and focus on the upcoming tournament. At that very moment, Nakuru finally approached Faith and Lavi, apologizing for being a little late and greeting them cheerfully. Taking a closer look at the girl, the protagonist asked with mild surprise whether she was indeed a member of the Dragonkin. Receiving an affirmative answer, the protagonist smiled broadly, realizing that Nakuru's unusual appearance looked very familiar to him. He immediately understood that standing before him was none other than his longtime friend Kyuko, who had taken on this form to participate in the competition. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.